involved there. 50 years ago today, the assassination unfortunately, of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. You'll see the flags at half-staff across New Jersey, throughout the entire country, I believe, but definitely at least in New Jersey. And joining me now on the Jersey Central Newsmaker Hotline to talk a little bit about the lasting legacy of Dr. King, a longtime friend and partner of WCTC Radio, an inspirational and spiritual leader for a long time. Gives me great pleasure to welcome back to the WCTC airwaves. We have Reverend Soaries, who is with us here this morning, Reverend Deforest Soaries. Good morning, Reverend. It's Burt Barron. What an honor to speak to you today. Thank you so much for the time.
Good morning, Mr. Barron. Thank you for your time.
50 years ago today, I watched a piece last night that was his last public speech, the final words that Dr. King ever said publicly. And I just couldn't help but think that this was a man that had so much more to give, Reverend Soaries. His final words were so poignant and so touching. And you would see and hear those words and say that this is just the start of big things. But unfortunately, it was the end of the message of Dr. King. How much work was unfinished, Reverend? How much more work did he have to do had he not been killed 50 years ago today? There was so many things that he still needed to accomplish, right?
Well, you're so right. His public career lasted a short 13 years. The Montgomery bus boycott started in 1955, and he was killed in 1968. He only had a 13-year tenure and died at 39 years old. I relate to it so personally. In many ways, I came to Somerset to be the pastor of First Baptist when I was 39 years old. So as I was just starting my ministry at 39 at our church, his ministry was ended. He had a lot more to do, of course. His focus was on poverty and trying to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots. But he did so much that it's reasonable to assume that God would allow others to take up the mantle to do the unfinished work, the right to vote, the right to have access to public accommodations, the right to fair housing. All of those rights became legal institutions as a result of Dr. King's leadership and spokesmanship.
Does he continue to influence young people in America today, by your estimation, Reverend Soaries? Do young people have a full appreciation of sort of the road that was paved by Dr. King?
Well, I think he does. In the first instance, the whole area of leadership, whether you're on the political left or the political right, I think what Dr. King has done is really establish a standard for leadership. He was articulate. He was courageous. He was self-sacrificing. And I think at every generation, whatever your issue or political perspective, we need people who are willing to stand up, speak truth to power, motivate people, sacrifice their own personal gain for some cause larger than themselves. And so in that sense, I think Dr. King, like Abraham Lincoln and like other great Americans to our history, gives us a glimpse into a leadership style, a leadership role that will always be relevant. I think he also had a personal, optimistic belief based on the ethic of love. When you really look at Dr. King, his optimism was based on the assumption that humans have the capacity to rise above their differences and have a genuine love and respect for one another. Today, we live in a very contentious political environment. We are experiencing through social media expressions that heretofore have been kept private that are now becoming public. And I think the love ethic, the sense that we're not only a nation, but we can become a beloved community where people truly love each other as humans, that's also a standard that will transcend time and generations.
Do you think he was aware of his own achievements, Reverend Soaries? I mean, while it was a very brief tenure, as you mentioned there. Was he aware of the difference that he was making, or was his daily life just sort of, I'm going to focus on today and make the biggest difference I can today and see where we can go from here? Or did he just did he appreciate what he was able to do in just such a brief window?
No, I know all of Dr. King's children. His wife was a friend of mine. I had the privilege of working for many of the people that worked for him. Jesse Jackson trained me when I was in my early 20s. And so I'm sure that Dr. King, in one sense, was very, very aware of his accomplishments. He was aware of the legislation that was passed. He stood behind Lyndon Johnson when the Voting Rights Act was passed. And so on that level, he was very aware that the laws had changed, that the barriers that had been legal were no longer existed. On the other hand, I think Dr. King was very frustrated in that he realized that these laws would not change people's hearts. And ultimately, the future of the nation depended much more on what people believed and how people behaved than it did what laws were passed and what legislation was signed.
You are
And
so
so that
right.
he died frustrated because he saw, even within the African American community, he saw an uptick in violence. He saw people needing an internal fortitude and having spiritual hope more than he would have liked. And so, in one sense, he was thrilled that the landscape of the country was permanently changed through legislation. But in a deeper sense, he was very frustrated because he knew that it was ultimately a need for values and for ethics and for belief systems that would make those changes impactful over the long haul.
You are so right. Laws are words on paper, Reverend Soaries, but it's about changing hearts and changing minds is what it came down to. That was the real struggle. That was the real battle there. Has there been anyone that you've seen over the past 50 years, Reverend Soaries, whether it's a modern person today or anyone publicly over the last 50 years, who you would draw a comparison to as perhaps being that generation's Dr. King, or will we never see another Dr. King in our lifetimes?
Well, King's leadership was focused on the historical realities that were represented by segregation. Segregation was for King the curse of the nation. It was the child of slavery, and King dedicated his life to eliminate those legal barriers that limited African Americans from their full potential. Once those barriers were demolished and once those victories were won, we needed different types of leadership. And so what we see today is more of a segmented leadership as opposed to a universal leadership. You know, segregation, Mr. Barron, affected all blacks equally, and so we needed a movement that addressed the broad brush of segregation and its effects. Today, we have leaders in education, for instance, an African-American woman, Ruth Simmons, who came from Princeton, became the first African-American to lead an Ivy League institution. And so in that sense, she is Dr. King in the educational realm. We have Ken Chenault, who is the CEO of American Express, and 3 or 4 others. Ken Frazier, right there in New Jersey, who's the CEO of Merck. You would say that they are now the Dr. Kings or the leaders in the corporate space. And so when you look at today, in the last 50 years, what we've seen, because the barriers have been removed, because the nation has become more open, we've seen leaders emerge in various sectors to accomplish in their area of endeavor what King accomplished in his.
Well, I'd like to see with the schools today, Reverend Soaries. I know a lot of schools are off today. If you're in school today, or even if you got the day off, I would just like young people who are listening or who are around today, take a few moments, go online, grab a book, and just do some little research. See what the legacy of Dr. King was all about. 50 years ago today, of course. So just if you're not familiar with him, read up. Just see a couple of things that he was able to accomplish in his lifetime. As we wrap up here, Reverend Soaries, if you were in front of a group of young people today and one of them said, I've heard of Dr. King. What's he all about? And attention span of a young person is very short, Reverend Soaries. What's the elevator speech when someone asks you about Dr. King? How do you summarize him in just a few sentences?
Well, Martin Luther King describes himself as a drum major for justice. He was concerned not only about how much people have, but how well people live. And he destroyed barriers, but also preached hope. And so Martin Luther King was the preeminent American leader whose concern was that everyone, black or white, male or female, rich or poor, uh, straight or gay. Any American should have the same opportunity to not only advance in their lives, but also to be treated with respect.
All right. Reverend Deforest Soaries from First Baptist Church of Lincoln Gardens, thank you so much for the time this morning. And you know you have a home here, and you always will at WCTC Radio, Reverend. So I thank you so much for the time this morning. All right?
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. All right. Jersey Central Traffic.